Michael finally bought his dream car, only to watch it get wrecked in his own driveway, not by chance, but by his overbearing neighbor Linda. She hid behind HOA rules, using them as an excuse for her destructive outburst, as if she were untouchable. But Michael had one card she didn't expect: undeniable video proof of her actions. And just wait until you hear how this shocking drama unfolded and why justice, in the end, came out on top. My name is Michael, and for as long as I can remember, I've always loved cars. Not just any cars, but the kind that make your heart race when you see them on the road. Growing up, I didn't come from a wealthy family. We never had shiny new vehicles sitting in the driveway. In fact, most of our family cars were old hand-me-downs that barely held together, the kind where you're praying the engine starts in the morning. But as a kid, I had this poster on my bedroom wall, a deep blue Dodge Challenger. It wasn't just a picture to me. It was a promise I made to myself. One day I was going to own that car. One day I'd work hard enough, save enough, and finally earn it. Fast forward to now. After years of overtime shifts, endless late nights at the office, and sacrificing vacations just to stack away a little more money, I finally did it. I walked into the dealership, and for the first time in my life, I signed the papers for my dream car. A brand new, dark blue Dodge Challenger. The moment the keys were in my hand, I felt this rush, like all the effort, the sweat, the stress. It was finally worth it. When I first sat in the driver's seat, the leather still smelled fresh. The engine purred like a beast waiting to be unleashed, and I honestly couldn't stop smiling. To me, this wasn't just a purchase, it was a milestone. It was proof that I had climbed a mountain I once thought was impossible. I parked it in my driveway that evening and just stood there for a while, staring at it like a proud parent. My neighbors walked by, and some even gave me a nod of approval or a quick, "Nice ride." For the first time in years, I felt like I was living a little piece of the dream. But little did I know, my happiness was about to be tested, and not by bad luck or by some accident, but by a person who seemed determined to ruin it. Enter Linda. Now every neighborhood has that neighbor, the one who seems to think they're in charge of everyone else. In my neighborhood, that neighbor was Linda, though most people secretly just called her Karen behind her back. She was on the HOA board, and she took her role way too seriously. I'm talking about someone who patrolled the streets with a notebook, scribbling down every tiny thing she didn't like. If your trash can was out 10 minutes past collection time, you'd get a notice. If your grass was an inch taller than she thought it should be, notice. If your kids laughed too loudly while playing outside, you guessed it, another complaint. She lived for control, and she thrived on confrontation. So, of course, the second I parked my brand new Dodge in my own driveway, it didn't take long for her to appear. I saw her walking over, that familiar sour expression glued to her face, like she had just bitten into a lemon. She folded her arms across her chest, glanced at the car, then at me, and shook her head like I had committed some unforgivable crime. "This car is too loud and completely inappropriate for our quiet neighborhood," she snapped. "The HOA does not approve of such purchases." I stood there for a moment, not sure if I should laugh or get angry. It was my car. on my property, paid for with my money. Who in the world did she think she was to march over and try to dictate what I could or couldn't drive? I tried to keep my cool, though inside I felt my blood start to boil. "Linda," I said calmly, "this is my yard, and these are my rules. I worked hard for this car, and I'm not asking anyone's permission to own it." Her eyes narrowed, and for a split second, I saw this spark of indignation, like she couldn't believe someone actually stood up to her. Most neighbors just rolled over and did whatever she demanded because they didn't want the headache of dealing with her constant complaints. But me? I wasn't about to let her ruin what should have been one of the happiest weeks of my life. She didn't say much after that, just let out this disapproving and stormed off toward her house. I figured that was the end of it. I thought maybe she'd grumble under her breath, complain to the HOA board, and then eventually drop it. After all, what could she actually do? The car was perfectly legal. I wasn't breaking any rules. But what I didn't realize in that moment was that this confrontation was just the beginning. That first sour look, that first nasty comment, was the opening shot in what would turn into a battle I never saw coming. As I went inside that night, I glanced back out the window at my Dodge sitting proudly in the driveway. The moonlight bounced off its glossy paint, and for a moment I tried to shake off what had just happened. I told myself, "Don't let her get to you, Michael. This is your car, your dream. Nobody can take this away from you." But deep down, I felt uneasy. Something about the way Linda had looked at me, not just angry, but determined, stuck in my mind. At that point, I had no idea how far she was willing to go. I had no idea that her obsession with rules and her desperate need for control would soon cross a line that no neighbor should ever cross. And while I thought I had shut the door on the confrontation, what Linda did next would leave me furious, heartbroken, and ready to fight back like never before. It happened only a few days later. I was inside, enjoying a rare quiet evening, when a sudden sharp crash cut through the silence. At first, I thought maybe it was a fallen branch, or something had tipped over in the yard. But then came another crash, louder this time, followed by a sickening crunch that made my stomach tighten. Something wasn't right. I rushed to the window, my heart already pounding, and what I saw made my chest drop. Out there, in my driveway, was Linda. She wasn't just standing there or yelling like she usually did. No. She was gripping a garden tool with both hands, swinging it with all her strength directly at my car. My brand new Dodge Challenger, the car I had dreamed of for years, the one I had worked endless nights to afford, was under attack. The headlights shattered like glass ornaments. The metallic thud of the tool hitting the hood echoed through the night. With each swing, more paint peeled, more dents formed, and the car that had once gleamed like a jewel was turning into wreckage right before my eyes. I froze for a moment, almost unable to process what I was seeing. It didn't feel real. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I bolted out the door and shouted, "What are you doing?" But she didn't stop. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she turned to me, eyes blazing with a kind of twisted satisfaction, and yelled, This is for breaking the rules of our community." Her voice rang with self-righteousness, like she truly believed she was performing some noble act. My jaw dropped. Breaking the rules? What rules? Owning a car wasn't against any regulation. Parking it in my own driveway wasn't against any law. Yet here she was, smashing years of my hard work into pieces, convinced she had the right to do it. I rushed closer, but before I could get within reach, she gave the hood one final, brutal strike, then dropped the tool to the ground and stormed back toward her house, as if she had won some kind of battle. I stood there, staring at the damage, unable to breathe for a moment. The glossy paint was scratched beyond recognition. The hood bore deep dents. The headlights hung in fragments. My dream car looked broken, beaten, almost unrecognizable. And that's when it hit me. Not just the sight of the wreckage, but the weight of everything I had poured into this car. The late nights, the skipped vacations, the weekends spent at the office instead of relaxing with friends. All those sacrifices had led to this moment. This was supposed to be my reward, my proof that the hard work paid off. And now? It was all destroyed in a matter of minutes, not by chance or by accident, but by the deliberate choice of someone who thought she was above everyone else. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and dialed the police. The whole time, I kept glancing at the damage, each glance making my chest ache more. The engine might still run, but the soul of the car, the pride I felt when I looked at it, that was gone. When the officer arrived, I felt a flicker of hope. Finally, someone in authority would step in. Surely this was clear-cut. Vandalism, destruction of property, evidence right there in plain sight. I expected handcuffs, questions, maybe even some reassurance that justice would be done. But instead, the officer looked over the damage, listened to my account, and then sighed. "This is the kind of thing you'd better settle through the HOA or civil court," he said, almost casually. I blinked at him, stunned. "What do you mean?" "She destroyed my car. You saw it. She admitted it." But the officer just shook his head, as if this was nothing more than a minor neighborly spat. "It's tricky. Since you're both in the same community, and she claims it's about HOA rules, it falls into a gray area. You'll have to take it up with them or file a civil complaint, a gray area. My car, worth more than anything else I owned, was sitting there in ruins, and this was being brushed off as a neighbor dispute. I felt the ground drop beneath me. It was like the world had tilted, like the rules of fairness and justice I believed in had suddenly disappeared. As the patrol car drove away, I stood alone in my driveway, staring at what was left of my dream. The street was quiet again, almost too quiet, like nothing had happened. But inside me, there was nothing but noise. Anger, disbelief, and a deep, crushing sense of helplessness. I had never felt so humiliated. To know that someone could walk onto my property, destroy what mattered to me most, shout it in my face as if it were justified, and then walk away without consequence. It made me feel small, powerless, as if no matter how hard I worked, no matter what I earned, someone else could come along and take it away, and there was nothing I could do. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the image of Linda's furious face, the swing of the tool, the crash of metal giving way. And every time I opened my eyes, I saw the damage sitting outside my window, a constant reminder of the injustice. At that point, I didn't know what to do next. All I knew was one thing. I couldn't let it end there. I couldn't just swallow the pain and accept that this was how things were. If nobody else would hold her accountable, then somehow, some way, I'd have to find a way to do it myself. For the rest of that night, I barely slept. Every time I looked out the window and saw the broken remains of my car, I felt that same knot in my stomach. But somewhere in between the anger and the frustration, a new thought started to form. If no one else was going to fight for me, maybe I could fight for myself. That's when I remembered something. Both my house and my Dodge had security cameras. I had installed them months ago, mostly for peace of mind. At the time, I never thought they'd capture anything important. But now, they were my lifeline. My last chance at proving that what happened wasn't some neighborly dispute, but cold, hard vandalism. I hurried to my computer and pulled up the recordings. My hands were trembling as I scrubbed through the timeline, searching for the moment it happened. And then, there it was. Linda, storming out of her house with that garden tool in hand. Linda raising it high above her head and swinging it down with every ounce of fury she could muster. Linda, step by step, dismantling the car I had worked my whole life to earn. Watching it made my blood boil, but at the same time it gave me clarity. This was undeniable. No one could argue with video evidence. I downloaded the files, backed them up in multiple places, and sat there for a long time staring at the screen. If the police wouldn't act, maybe I didn't need them. Maybe it was time to shine a light on the truth in front of the very people she claimed to represent. The next day was the monthly HOA meeting. Normally, I avoided these gatherings at all costs. They were long, boring, and always dominated by Linda's voice. She loved those meetings. It was her stage. She'd stand there waving her papers, reciting rules of proper behavior as if she were the guardian of morality in our little neighborhood. Most people sat quietly, nodding, too tired after work to argue with her endless list of complaints. But this time was different. This time, I was ready. I walked into the community center with my flash drive tucked into my pocket. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from anticipation. This was it, my chance to show everyone who she really was. The room was filled with the usual chatter. Neighbors whispered among themselves, flipping through the printed agendas. At the front, Linda stood confidently, her arms crossed, surveying the room like she owned it. When the meeting officially began, she launched into her usual lecture, talking about lawn heights, fence colors, and trash bins left out too long. Her tone was sharp, scolding, as if we were all children in need of correction. I sat quietly for the first few minutes, letting her have her moment. But the entire time I could feel the weight of that flash drive in my pocket, the proof, the truth, the key that could finally break through her facade. When the agenda reached the section about community standards, I raised my hand. Linda looked at me with thinly veiled annoyance, clearly expecting some minor complaint she could brush aside. Instead, I stood up, cleared my throat, and said loudly enough for the room to hear, "Since we're talking about rules, I think it's worth looking at something." The room grew quiet. A few heads turned in my direction. Linda tilted her head, frowning, but before she could speak, I walked to the projector at the front and plugged in my flash drive. "Just a quick video," I added, my voice steady but my pulse racing. The screen flickered to life, and then, frame by frame, the truth unfolded. Linda, gripping that garden tool. Linda, smashing my car's headlights. Linda, leaving deep dents in the hood, her expression twisted with fury. The sound of the impact echoed through the speakers, filling the silent room. For a moment, nobody spoke. You could feel the shock ripple through the audience. People leaned forward in their chairs, eyes wide. Some covered their mouths. Others turned to look at Linda, whose face was draining of color by the second. There it was. Proof. Not just my word against hers, not just some dispute, but undeniable evidence of what she had done. Standing there, watching the room's reaction, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, yes, but also relief. For the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel powerless. I felt in control. The truth was out, and it was no longer just my burden to carry. I glanced at Linda. She was frozen in her chair, eyes darting around the room, searching for a way out. But there was no way out. Everyone had seen it. Everyone knew. And in that moment, I realized something important. Justice doesn't always come from the places you expect. Sometimes it comes from standing up, refusing to be silent, and showing the truth to the world, no matter how uncomfortable it makes the guilty. The silence in the room stretched on, heavy and undeniable. And for the first time since this all began, I knew the tide was finally turning. For a few seconds after the video ended, there was nothing but silence. A heavy, stunned kind of silence that seemed to hang in the air like fog. Everyone was frozen, staring at the screen, processing what they had just witnessed. And then it happened. A sharp intake of breath from one corner of the room, followed by several gasps scattered across the audience. "That's a crime!" someone finally shouted. The spell broke. Murmurs erupted across the hall, voices rising as people exchanged shocked comments. Neighbors, who had once nodded politely at Linda's endless rules, were now shaking their heads, whispering furiously. I could see their expressions changing, disbelief melting into outrage, outrage sharpening into resolve. And then all eyes turned to Linda. Her once confident posture had crumbled. Her face, usually flushed with authority, had drained of all color. She tried to speak, fumbling for words, her voice trembling. This isn't real. It's fake. A setup. He doctored it," she stammered, her hands flailing slightly, as if she could push the truth back into the shadows. But it was too late. The video had spoken louder than any words ever could. The HOA chairman, a man who usually avoided conflict at all costs, stood up slowly from his seat at the front. His face was stern, his eyes unwavering as he looked directly at Linda. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority the entire room needed to hear. "Linda," he said firmly, "you are immediately removed from the board." The room went silent again, but this time it was different. The silence wasn't confusion or shock. It was agreement. It was the collective acknowledgement that justice was finally being served. The chairman continued, his voice steady and resolute. "In addition, the HOA will cover Michael's damages, and a copy of this recording will be provided to the police for review." It was everything I had hoped for and more. I hadn't expected such a swift and decisive response, but seeing it unfold right before my eyes was almost surreal. I felt the weight on my chest begin to lift. For weeks, I had been carrying the burden of injustice, feeling isolated and unheard. Now, in a single moment, the truth had been laid bare, and the tide had turned completely. What struck me even more was the reaction of my neighbors. People I barely knew, people who had once avoided getting involved, were now standing up, speaking out, and looking directly at me. "Michael, I'm so sorry you had to go through this. She had us all fooled. We should have seen it sooner. Don't worry, we've got your back." The words washed over me like a wave of support I never knew I needed. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I wasn't standing alone. Linda, meanwhile, seemed to shrink into herself. She gathered her papers with trembling hands, her gaze fixed on the floor. No more lectures, no more scolding tone, no more superiority. She kept her head down, avoiding the stares of the very people she once controlled with her rules. And then, almost like a defeated shadow, she slipped out of the hall, her face hidden, her power gone. The contrast couldn't have been more striking. Just 24 hours earlier, she had seemed untouchable, an unshakable force in the neighborhood. But in the end, all it took was one undeniable truth to strip away the mask. My car still needed repairs, yes. The dents and shattered glass were still there, a reminder of her anger. But standing in that hall, surrounded by my neighbor's support, I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt triumphant. Because this was never just about a car. It was about respect, about fairness, about proving that no one, no matter how entitled or self-righteous, is above accountability. And as I walked out of the community center that night, a strange sense of peace settled over me. I had faced the storm, endured the injustice, and stood tall when it mattered most. I realized something powerful in that moment. Sometimes, all it takes is one brave step to transform pain into strength. One choice to turn your suffering into a weapon of justice. The road to that night had been filled with frustration, anger, and doubt. But in the end, the truth prevailed. And the truth, once revealed, cannot be silenced. I drove past my damaged car later that evening and smiled for the first time in weeks. Yes, it still bore the scars of what she had done, but now those scars told a story, not of defeat, but of resilience. They were a reminder that even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you, persistence and courage can flip the script. And maybe, just maybe, this story would live on in our neighborhood as more than just the night Linda got caught. Maybe it would serve as a reminder that integrity matters, that communities are strongest when they stand together, and that bullies, no matter how loud, eventually face the consequences of their actions. For me, it was more than a victory. It was a turning point, a reminder that justice isn't always handed down from the top. Sometimes it rises from within us, from the courage to speak, to act, and to refuse silence. And that's why I'll never forget that night. Not because my neighbor was exposed, but because I discovered something within myself. The strength to stand tall, the resilience to keep fighting, and the hope that even the smallest voice can bring down the loudest injustice. That was the night I stopped being afraid. That was the night I turned my pain into triumph.